Before Breath of the Wild released, A Link to the Past was championed by people who hated Ocarina of Time. That's not to say that everyone who preferred A Link to the Past was an Ocarina hater, but rather that for the longest time it was the only Zelda game that even came close to Ocarina of Time in popularity. Many people consider this game to be the gold standard for the series, an entry that invented and solidified the tropes for the series to come by evolving the original game's concepts into something more modern. I'm not one of those people. Don't get me wrong, I love A Link to the Past, but at the same time I've always been a bit more critical of it than others. In a lot of ways I think it's far more iterative than it is truly groundbreaking, being more of a bridge between the first game and the later titles. A Link to the Past is certainly a shift in direction for the series, and while I think that shift works for the most part, it's also one that doesn't feel fully realized at times and can even feel like it loses some of the nuance of the game that it's an evolution of. Take combat, for example. In the first game, the player had a variety of options to deal with enemies. The sword was obviously the main attack, but you also had plenty of secondary weapons like the bow, bombs, and candle. The second game focused almost exclusively on the swordplay, as none of your items were useful in combat. A Link to the Past brings back the top-down perspective of Zelda 1, and because of that, the combat naturally invites surface-level comparisons to that game. The problem is that A Link to the Past doesn't have the same combat as the first game. There's a much heavier emphasis on using the sword here. Now instead of a simple stab, Link swings the sword in an arc in front of him. It makes actually hitting enemies a lot easier than in the first game, especially combined with the game's 8-directional movement making positioning a lot more flexible. If you hold down the attack button, you also charge up a spin attack, giving you even more of a spread and twice the damage at the cost of some of your mobility. It's an element of risk and reward that wasn't in the first two games. There's even a dash attack unlocked via an item obtained after the first dungeon, allowing you to close the distance between enemies. The sword mechanics have evolved past the original game and even take a few elements from Zelda 2, and for what it's worth, I really like it. Combat feels like it's mostly designed around the sword and its limitations. The problem is that evolution of the sword downplays the use of items in combat. In the first game, your sword attacks were stiff stabs that you had to line yourself up with and fully commit to. The sword was your main method of attack, but was so cumbersome that it was constantly in your best interest to use a secondary item, even if it meant using a limited supply of resources to do it. Nearly every item that could do damage covered the weaknesses of other items. Bombs were fantastic because they could damage enemies from any angle without needing to be near them. The bow could do everything the sword could, but at an unlimited range. Both of these weapons relied on a resource to work though, so you couldn't just use them constantly. Instead, you had to rely on the unwieldy sword in order to save resources until they were absolutely necessary. If I had to compare it to anything, it would be less like any of the Zeldas to come after it and far more like Castlevania. Zelda 2 also placed a far heavier emphasis on the swordplay than the first game, but it didn't downplay the items because the items were designed completely differently. Sure, the spells could help in combat, but with the exception of the last two spells in the game, each of them only served to further your ability to use your sword, and they were arguably even more limited by resources than the items in the first game, since they all pulled from the same magic meter. A Link to the Past continues to expand the swordplay, but in doing so, items are no longer remotely as useful in combat. The area of effect that bombs have isn't as useful when your sword covers such a wide area. It's so much easier to approach enemies that there's rarely ever a need to use a projectile of any kind, and even if there were, the bow is outclassed in almost every way by other items or even throwable objects. Now, to be clear, this isn't strictly a bad thing. It's just an example of how A Link to the Past shifts the focus of the series. Items don't need to be used in combat in order to be good items. The magic key in Zelda 1 proves this. If they can be used in interesting ways outside of combat, then it shouldn't matter how well they're used inside of combat. The problem is that A Link to the Past is kind of hit or miss with its items. Some of them are adapted into this new direction pretty well, but others can feel stuck in the past. The bombs are an easy example. In the first game, they were a test of your resource management. You had to use them thoughtfully or else you'd risk running out. In A Link to the Past, however, bombs are handed out like candy, and on the rare occasion you need to use them to open a hole in the wall or floor, it's clearly marked by an obvious crack. Let me ask you something. How many times have you personally run out of bombs in A Link to the Past, or really any Zelda after the first? Bombs as a limited resource just don't work as well when you're unlikely to ever run out of them. Instead, the game uses the bombs as more of a puzzle-solving tool than before. The timing of the fuse is a common use, such as when the game asks the player to place a bomb and quickly move behind a switch block. You can also pick up and throw bombs starting in this game, and the game will often test your spatial reasoning and timing by having puzzles that require the bomb to be thrown from a specific point in order for it to work. As far as puzzle design goes, A Link to the Past handles using bombs well enough. At the same time, however, there are elements of how the first game utilizes them left over despite the fact that the game simply isn't designed around those elements. Why is there still a bomb counter if the game isn't going to penalize wasting bombs? Why have bombs as a reward for exploring if it's so easy to keep a full inventory? Why bother letting me expand my bomb capacity if I'm never going to run out of them in the first place? Is this a massive game-breaking issue? Not in the slightest. At its absolute worst, it just means that the bombs you find in chests don't feel nearly as rewarding as they should. But it does illustrate that this game does a poor job of understanding why bombs were such a good resource in Zelda 1, which I think is a running theme with this game in general. The bomb counter isn't expanded upon in any way, it's just a holdover from how they used to work. The bow is in a similar position. In Zelda 1, it was a powerful early game ranged weapon with the drawback of using a rupee every time you used it. Rupees were a vital resource in that game, so using the bow in combat was an option you had to heavily consider. A Link to the Past instead has a separate arrow resource that the bow pulls from. The arrows now have just as much of an importance placed on them as the bombs do, and because of that, they also have the exact same drawbacks. Having arrows as a separate resource would have been okay if the game ever put more of an emphasis on the bow as a combat item specifically, but as I've discussed earlier, items in general have a lot less of an emphasis placed on them in the game's combat, and even when ranged weapons are useful, there are very few instances where the bow is the best option outside of one or two boss fights. The bow fills a very specific niche in this game, one that comes up so infrequently that you are almost never going to run out of arrows. It's another example of A Link to the Past trying to expand upon something in the first game without fully understanding what made it work, but unlike the bombs, the bow doesn't have the benefit of being utilized creatively in puzzle design. The most the bow is ever used is when the player is told to shoot a statue in the eye, which is incredibly basic and isn't even much of an expansion from how they used the bow in the first game. Now this isn't to say that every resource in the game is mishandled. The magic meter returns from Zelda 2. That game was designed around using the list of spells while the more traditionally obtained items took a back seat, and because of that, the magic meter was the biggest focus of the game's challenge. Spells are no longer a thing in A Link to the Past. Instead, the magic meter is now used with specific items obtained normally. These items tend to be used heavily in the game's puzzles, so it's far more lenient than its predecessor when it comes to how much each item costs to use. But while that leniency was a major issue for the arrows and bombs, it's much more reasonable with the magic, if only because magic is used for far more than just a single item. An entire 10 items cost magic in this game, many of which are used pretty frequently. As much as I love how the magic meter is used in Zelda 2, I also think that the way it's utilized in A Link to the Past is far more suited to the way the game's challenges are designed. A major part of that is because it comes paired with one of the greatest mechanics ever to be introduced into a Zelda game. Bottles. Bottles are brilliant. In the first game, your ability to heal is almost completely dependent on finding the note that lets you buy potions. After that, once you have enough money, it's never not in your best interest to buy a red potion. It works, but it's completely static. A Link to the Past instead has the player start with no healing ability whatsoever, only to let the game introduce and expand that healing ability by letting the player find up to 4 bottles in the world. This is not what makes bottles so great. After all, that's basically just what the first game does multiplied by 4. What makes it so great is the fact that bottles don't just gatekeep your healing ability, they also gatekeep your ability to regain magic. There are 3 types of potions. Red potions completely fill your health, green potions completely fill your magic, and blue potions completely fill both. Magic isn't nearly as difficult to manage as in Zelda 2, but it's still utilized often enough that any given player is going to be running out of it regularly throughout their time playing the game. The green potion will help you with that, but for every 1 green potion you buy, you lose the ability to heal 1 more time. You absolutely don't want to run out of magic in a dungeon because you'll no longer be able to progress and will effectively have to start over, but if you die in a dungeon, it won't matter anyway. Alternatively, you could purchase a blue potion, but those are significantly more expensive, and money can be pretty tight in this game if you don't know what you're doing, so this itself is a risky maneuver. Even if you do buy them, they're not as overpowered as you might think. Refilling both health and magic might cover your bases, but in practice you're rarely ever going to need to refill both at once. You're mainly paying extra for the convenience of not needing to worry about which type of potion to take. If you're willing to grind for the money or happen to know where the secret money locations are, you can forego needing to worry about which potion to use. Fairies can also be caught and kept in a bottle. They'll revive you if you're killed, but unlike the potion, they only refill a small amount of hearts. This is important because healing in Zelda games is something that you have to properly time. Even if you have a red potion, you're still going to die if you're not paying enough attention to your health to use it. The fairies are a safety net for less experienced players to use, and are in turn less effective than using a potion. Nearly every aspect of the bottle, aside from the bees, revolves around giving the player a choice that fits their playstyle while also having an effect on different aspects of the game's difficulty. Something else I find interesting about the magic items in this game is that a lot of them ultimately serve a similar purpose. That sounds like a bad thing, but sometimes the nuances between those items can lead to different approaches to the level design. For instance, there are a lot of dungeon rooms where you're required to light torches to progress. It's so prevalent that the very first chest in the game contains the lantern, which is your only means of lighting them until you eventually get the fire rod out of Skull Woods. This will also light torches, but unlike the lantern, which will only light things directly in front of you, the fire rod will shoot a ball of fire across the screen at the cost of significantly more magic. Sometimes the game requires you to use the fire rod, but more often than not it will give you the choice to use the lantern instead. On the surface, that makes the lantern seem like the more effective of the two items, but a lot of the time the game will place the torches in a way that gives an advantage to the fire rod. In this room you can technically light the torches with the lantern, but the torches will go out if they're not lit quickly enough. Even if you've already opened the door, it will quickly shut if one of the torches goes out before you walk through. You barely have enough time to lift the skulls and light the torches if you use the lantern, but if you forego that and use the fire rod on the bottom torch, you can cut out a few seconds and give yourself some wiggle room to get through the door on time. It becomes a matter of risk and reward. Using the fire rod might use more magic than the lantern, but if you fail at using the lantern, you'll end up using more magic anyway. Unfortunately, the redundant items aren't always so elegantly implemented. The magic cape and cane of Birna, for example. Both of these items use magic to make you invulnerable, but the specific way they do so makes them both excel in certain situations. There's one major issue with this, however, being the location of the cane of Birna. Dark Death Mountain is almost always going to be one of the last locations any player will visit on account of the fact that the only required points of interest are the last two dungeons of the game, so while you can technically reach the cave containing the cane as soon as you obtain the hammer out of Palace of Darkness, it's never convenient enough to do so, especially since the magic cape only requires one more dungeon and is in an area that you have access to as soon as you finish the game's intro. Even worse, once you get to that cave, the cane is at the end of a long, winding hallway consisting of spikes you need to walk across. While you don't need to use the magic cape to get across, you could also just run across and waste your potions, the game clearly intends for it to be the primary method to obtain it. This means that your options are either to go out of your way to a late game area and waste potions so you can have an invincibility item in a dungeon that really isn't difficult enough to warrant needing it in, or just wait until it's more convenient to obtain the cane when the game is almost over. The thing is, this could easily have been fixed just by swapping the cane with another item. In this point in the Dark World, there's a cave leading to a ledge with a heart piece on it. It's only a few screens away from the location of the magic cape, and is the only location in the entire game that strictly requires it. If the cane were here, it would still keep the progression from cape to cane, while also being a much more enticing option for the player to get early on. In addition, moving the heart piece to the spike cave lets it act as sort of a tutorial for first-time players to figure out how the two items differ so they could be better acquainted with the items the next time they play through the game. Then there's the trio of medallions, Quake, Ether, and Bombos. These are weird. All three of them are screen-clearing magic attacks. Ether and Quake are required exactly once to open up Misery Mire and Turtle Rock respectively, but apart from that, the differences between these items are their secondary effects. Bombos is considered a fire attack for the purposes of clearing out one specific enemy found exclusively in the Ice Palace. Ether turns enemies into ice and can also reveal hidden paths that you'd otherwise need to light torches to see, which is neat but not nearly as interesting or lucrative as Bombos letting you get the blue mail and golden sword early. Quake knocks items out of trees that you could just as easily get by dashing into them with the Pegasus boots. Seriously, I had to look this up. Quake is just completely pointless, especially considering that it's in an isolated location and yet is still required for whatever reason. I'll go into this in more depth later, but the Bombos Medallion is an incredibly well-designed item specifically because of how it's not required, only for its two cousins to just be there because they wanted to require one more thing in order to open up dungeons that really didn't need that one more thing. They could have rolled all three of these into a single item and nothing of value would have been lost. Now, when I said that items weren't as useful in combat, there were a few exceptions. The hammer is obtained within the first Dark World dungeon and acts as an alternative melee weapon. It does more damage than the Master Sword at the cost of having a significantly smaller hitbox, adding an element of risk and reward to combat. It also incentivizes getting the Tempered Sword early since it does the same amount of damage as the hammer with none of the drawbacks. I wish the game gave it to you earlier since by the time you get it there's really only one dungeon separating you from the Tempered Sword, but that's more of a complaint towards the game's structure than the item itself. The Cane of Samaria is a fascinating one. It places a block down that damages enemies on contact, can be picked up and thrown like you would a pot or a bomb, holds down switches, and even shoots out projectiles when dispelled. It's one of the most unique items in the series and surprisingly has its niche in combat. Is it useful in the puzzle design? I'll get to that. Of course, not every item in the game is interesting enough to warrant that much discussion. A lot of them barely feel like items at all, more like glorified keys dressed up as upgrades. The Power Glove, for instance, certainly exists.
I love the Power Glove. It's so bad.
Yeah, he wasn't kidding. Remember last time when I said I don't like items that act only as passive upgrades that lock the player out of the next dungeon? The Power Glove is basically that. It lets the player lift up these rocks, allowing them to get to the third dungeon as well as unlock a few more minor areas here and there. You never have to think about using the Power Glove. It's never utilized in a particularly interesting way, you just see a boulder and lift it up. The worst part is that there's a second one. I'll give the Titan's Mitt the edge over the Power Glove if only because it gives you full access to the Dark World, and therefore obtaining it makes the game more interesting. But both of these items are completely lame, and only made worse by the fact that they're dungeon items. For that matter, the Moon Pearl. It serves the exhilarating purpose of preventing Link from turning into a bunny rabbit when he enters the Dark World. This one in particular annoys me because this could have been an excellent item. Let me show you the first time you enter the Dark World. In Death Mountain, there's a peak between you and the third dungeon. In order to pass this peak, you go into the Dark World and find that part of the mountain is missing. Then you warp back while standing on the missing piece. It's a good introduction to how the Dark World works mechanically, and the bunny transformation serves to limit your options within the Dark World until you obtain the Moon Pearl. You then enter the Tower of Hera, the dungeon that contains the Moon Pearl. Why? Why bother having the bunny transformation as a mechanic if you're just going to make it irrelevant 5 minutes later? This could have been significantly more interesting if the game opened up earlier too. Having to navigate the Dark World for large portions of the game early on until you obtain the Moon Pearl could have made for an additional element of player agency that I enjoy so much, but instead it's an item that doesn't even gate the player like the gloves do. All it does is remove a potential challenge before it even becomes one. So far, I've been very critical of A Link to the Past. Maybe not going as far as to say that any one aspect of it is bad, but most of my comparisons towards Zelda 1 have been in that game's favor. So you might be asking if there's anything about this game that I think is an improvement, and the answer to that is yes, there is. A Link to the Past has the best overworld yet, if not the best one in the entire series. The first game is one of my favorite games ever, but even I can't deny that its biggest flaw is its overworld. It's big and filled with secrets, sure, but nearly all of those secrets come in the form of caverns that require the player to randomly set fires and waste precious bombs until they happen to come across a cave. More often than not, those secrets are nothing more than 10 or 30 rupees, with a lot of the secrets even punishing the player by taking away rupees. It takes away the incentive to explore and causes the game to become significantly less fun if you don't already know what you're doing, and at that point you're not going to care about most of the secrets in the game anyway. Without those secrets, most of the tiles tend to feel unimportant, like they only exist to be a stopgap in between dungeons. It's not a particularly big deal in a game with a map that can be crossed in less than a minute, but it's still a criticism nonetheless. There's also a frequent issue of tiles running together, particularly on the eastern side of the map where half the screens consist of little more than green trees arranged in seemingly random patterns. This is okay in the dungeons, where the entire point is to figure out a semi-linear path to the end, and the number of potential locations for a bombable wall in any given room was no more than 4 at the most, but in an overworld that's mostly open-ended, it doesn't really add too much. It's not a bad overworld, heck, it's not even the worst overworld in the classic games, but there was a lot of room for improvement. Zelda 2 basically gave up on trying to improve upon it and replaced the overworld with a strictly linear one. You're basically guided along a set path for the majority of the game. You'll visit new areas, but in nearly every instance those new areas are visited once before you backtrack to the central path and move on to the next area. Secrets are almost always marked by an obvious visual indicator, be it a cave or a single tile of different terrain, to the point where I hesitate to even call them secrets. It gets the job done, but it's on a different wavelength entirely from the first game and is the biggest argument in favor of its black sheep status. A Link to the Past not only goes back to having a world structure more similar to the first game, but it fixes nearly every aspect of it. There is very little wasted space here. Nearly every location has something in it, a landmark that's completely unique to that area of the game, and that something is almost always tied to a directly beneficial reward like a heart piece or a new item. These rewards are also hidden in significantly better ways, usually by context clues that subtly tell the player where they are without being as obvious as a crack in the wall or a boulder in front of a cave. One of the bottles, for example, is given to you by a hobo underneath the bridge in southeastern Hyrule. It's only accessible by swimming underneath, and there's a triangular-shaped section of shallow water you can stand in. Ordinarily, this shallow area wouldn't be anything noteworthy, but there aren't any convenient methods of entering the water around it. Suddenly, that shallow part becomes a question. Why would they put a place for me to stand there if I can't reach it? What's so special about this area? It incentivizes the player to figure out how to get there. An example of an easier reward is in the desert area. There's a ledge on the western side with a heart piece on it. It's out in the open, but the player has no way of reaching it, so they move on to the desert palace. Halfway through the desert palace, the player exits the dungeon to a previously inaccessible ledge connecting the two halves of the dungeon. The ledge clearly goes further south, and any player paying enough attention will remember the heart piece from earlier and make the slight detour to get it. The overworld is filled with challenges that are less overtly puzzle-based than the dungeons and more focused on testing the player's ability to memorize the world and rationally figure out how to find its treasures. And then they made it brown. Having an alternate, dark version of the world is a very common gimmick in exploration-heavy games, with Zelda itself being no stranger to reusing it every once in a while. The implementation of this gimmick tends to range in quality from being pretty decent in games like Metroid Prime 2 to absolute garbage in games like Symphony of the Night.
I don't hate you, I just hate the second half of you.
Regardless, A Link to the Past is the first game to attempt a gimmick like this to my knowledge, and it knocks it out of the park. Every single landmark in the game has a Dark World alternative. The major ones usually have entire dungeons dedicated to them, but even the small ones contain something of interest. The world is nearly one-to-one, at least in terms of its layout, and the player is tasked with finding the few differences between the two in order to unlock new areas, whether it be for a required dungeon or for an optional treasure. On a major scale, this could be remembering that the Zora waterfall was in a very obscure and out-of-the-way location and searching for a way to find its Dark World equivalent. By doing so, you're rewarded with a Quake medallion, but it's still a good use of the Dark World. On a smaller scale, it could be realizing that there's a cave exit on the Dark World version of the floating island, but not the Light World version which holds a heart piece, or realizing that a ledge in the graveyard has no way to access it while the Dark World version has a ladder. If you watched my video on Zelda 1, you'll remember that one of the things that make the game work so well is how it rewards players for memorizing its world and mechanics, and the Dark World and improvements to the overworld design in general are great evolutions of that concept. Zelda 1 rewarded the player's knowledge of the game by letting the player do things out of order, allowing them to obtain items earlier than usual and completely recontextualize their playthrough. Zelda 2 backed away from this in favor of a much more structured experience, resulting in a game where the progression was far more intuitive for a first-time player while also being less interesting. A Link to the Past, in turn, takes a best-of-both-worlds approach to progression. The first 5 dungeons all have to be completed in order, while the next 6 allow you to figure out the different ways to complete them. Story-wise, this is contextualized as the Light World being the first half of the game with the Dark World being the second half, though you actually have to do the first Dark World dungeon before the game truly opens up. The first game did something similar to this by locking the later dungeons behind the raft and stepladder, but it didn't divide the game as cleanly since you could still do the first 2 dungeons after most of the late game dungeons if you wanted to. In A Link to the Past, you are always going to be doing the first half of the game in a strict order. This gives any first-time player ample time to learn how the game's mechanics work before the game gets more complicated. It also means that the developers are able to guarantee that any given player is going to have specific items by the time they reach a specific area and can utilize them more frequently. It's an alright compromise, but the drawback is that I tend to find the first half of this game less interesting than the second half, and the item that illustrates my point the best just so happens to be one of the most important things that this game introduces. Look, as a part of the series' mythos and lore, the Master Sword is awesome, and I fully believe that the series would be worse off without it. I love its design, I love its importance as the Blade of Evil's Bane, and I love the expanded lore it gets in later entries. As a gameplay mechanic, though, it kinda sucks. Not just in A Link to the Past, but in nearly every Zelda it's ever been in. In A Link to the Past, the Master Sword is the second sword in the game, after the Fighter's Sword. It does twice as much damage, has a longer reach, and shoots out a sword beam when you're at full health. These are all great upgrades that make combat significantly easier. That's the problem. Not only are you required to obtain the Master Sword, but you are required to obtain the Master Sword specifically in between the Tower of Hera and your second visit to Hyrule Castle. These buffs to your attack would be great if obtaining them was something within the player's control, but they're not. The combat gets easier as soon as the player obtains the Master Sword, but that gets boring, so the developers compensate by giving the enemies in later areas more health, completely negating the extra damage that the Master Sword provides. Now the only effect that obtaining the Master Sword has is making the earlier areas of the game even easier than they already were to begin with. It's a catch-22, because I do think that the Master Sword needs to be required in order for it to have the proper impact in the story, but requiring it causes it to be a poorly implemented item. It's not too big of a deal in A Link to the Past since the Master Sword can be further upgraded twice after obtaining it, and those upgrades are mostly optional and give the player far more agency as to when they can obtain it. But later games don't have that saving grace, so it's still a precedent that I don't quite care for. After that halfway point though, the game starts to lean into the same elements of player agency that make me love Zelda 1 so much. The easiest example is the Tempered Sword. Once you obtain the Titansmiths out of Thieves Town, you can rescue this dwarven blacksmith from the Dark World and bring him back to his home, where he'll upgrade your sword for you. Thieves Town is labeled as the 4th Dark World dungeon, but you only need the item out of the 1st Dark World dungeon to access it, so nothing is stopping the player from doing it early once they realize this. A Link to the Past takes it a step further than just testing the player's knowledge of when to use an item, and also rewards the player's knowledge of how to use the item. For instance, throughout the Ice Palace, the player needs to fight Freezors, an enemy that can only be defeated by fire attacks. Ordinarily, you'd need the Fire Rod out of Skullwoods in order to dispose of them, but anyone who knows the game well enough will also know that the optional Bombos medallion can also defeat them, letting you do the Ice Palace before Skullwoods if you so choose. The first room of Misery Mire normally requires the hookshot out of Swamp Palace to get across, but if you use the Pegasus boots to run into this block, you can use the recoil to bounce across the gap. This seems unintended, but later on in Ganon's Tower there's an optional room that requires you to use the same trick to access. I single out these two dungeons for two reasons. The first is that the items in these two dungeons complement each other incredibly well. Ice Palace gives you the Blue Mail, which halves all damage taken. Misery Mire is one of the easiest dungeons to take a lot of damage in, so you're incentivized to do Ice Palace first. On the other hand, navigating the Ice Palace can be confusing and even a little tedious, so you might want to go to Misery Mire first because its item lets you skip the last third of the dungeon. Like the first game, these two dungeons are harder in ways that give the player a reason to want to do one over the other based on whether they're better at combat or navigation. The other reason why I bring up these two dungeons is that once you complete them, they unlock the Big Bomb, which opens up a fairy fountain containing the silver arrows as well as the final sword upgrade. These are the two strongest weapons in the game, and they're obtainable 2 dungeons early. A Link to the Past has the basis of a good evolution of some of my favorite aspects of the first game here. The problem is that I've basically already told you the extent it takes this. There are 1 or 2 more instances of the game pulling this kind of design, but they're all incredibly minor and are never enough to really affect what order you want to do the dungeons in. Even getting the Golden Sword early isn't as great as it seems. It's neat that I can get the best sword in the game 2 dungeons early, but at the same time those 2 dungeons aren't particularly difficult in any way that makes the extra damage that enticing. While I don't think that A Link to the Past implements this trope as thoroughly as the first game, I'd be lying if I said that it's not one of this game's strengths. Combined with the sheer scale of the game along with the Dark World gimmick, this design trope makes the act of learning and memorizing A Link to the Past incredibly satisfying. When obtaining one major item, an experienced player will know exactly what locations have been unlocked. This is what makes randomizers such a popular genre of ROM hack for the series, and I think that out of every Zelda game, A Link to the Past lends itself to being randomized the absolute best in no small part due to the sheer quantity of items to find. This is the biggest thing that makes A Link to the Past such a fun game to return to for me, even if it means having to deal with some of its less than stellar dungeon design. Now, A Link to the Past is generally considered the advent of the classic dungeon formula, but like the other aspects of this game that I've talked about, it really feels more like a transitionary phase between the older games and the more modern ones. In the first game, the dungeons were less standardized and more loose in their progression. Locked doors are treated almost like a toll, a check to make sure that you've been managing your collection of keys well enough. In Zelda 2 onwards, the locked doors almost always have one specific key that's intended to be used with them, and rarely do they give you more keys than you'll need to finish the dungeon. That's fine, but a dungeon can't rely on just that in order to be interesting. Zelda 2 managed to add to it by introducing another resource that the entire game was designed around, but later games opted for a more involved design. Each room has a set way for you to unlock the exit, usually involving a dungeon item or a mechanic that directly ties into said item. A Link to the Past only gets this half right. It does compartmentalize each of these challenges like the later games, but rarely in a particularly involved way, and almost never using a specific item in any major capacity. It makes both the dungeons and the items feel underdeveloped as a result. Take Eastern Palace as an example. As far as first dungeons go, it's not the worst ever. The layout is relatively simple, but it forces the player to loop around it in a way that showcases the point of the Big Key, a mechanic introduced in A Link to the Past. It's a similar design trope that many other dungeons throughout the series use to showcase their items. The problem is that the Big Key isn't the dungeon item, the bow is. Like I said before, the bow isn't really utilized all too much in the dungeon or puzzle design in this game. That worked fine for dungeons in the first game because they were rarely designed around the progression of obtaining a new item, but Eastern Palace isn't designed like the dungeons in the first game. It's linear, with a very obvious path that the player is supposed to take to get to the end, filled with rooms that have a single way to solve them. Despite this, the bow is only required to kill one specific enemy type that shows up in exactly 2 rooms, something that the original game did to basically the same extent. The rest of the rooms consist of challenges that are non-specific and don't have much of a theme they build towards. I suppose pressing a switch on the floor is used a few times, but the most they ever do with it is add a few fake switches that cause the player to take an extra 5 seconds to figure it out. It's not exceptionally tedious or anything, it's just kinda simplistic and not particularly interesting, even for a first dungeon. A lot of other dungeons struggle with this too. Desert Palace contains the Power Glove, and it's used exactly once throughout the entire dungeon. There is a theme to this dungeon, but it does such a bad job of establishing itself that I didn't even realize that it was a theme until the playthrough where I got this footage from. See these beamos? The idea is that their beams can't hit you if you're hiding behind a wall or statue, so you have to hide behind them when they look at you. That's it. The dungeon gimmick is a minor hazard. The rest of the dungeon amounts to simplistic puzzles. Lift pot to find switch, kill all enemies, avoid cannonballs, lift pot to find switch, push block to open door, lift pot to find key, kill all enemies, lift pot to find key, lift pot to find key, light torches, boss. You'll notice that there are a lot of rooms in this dungeon that amount to lifting pots to find the way forward. That's kind of a running theme in this game. Nearly every dungeon has at least a few rooms where the only challenge is finding which pot or enemy has the single key that's required to enter the next room. Sometimes they're in rooms with different layouts, but those do little to change the fact that a large portion of the rooms in this game feel like filler. Even when the dungeon has a theme in this game, it tends to do a poor job of evolving that theme beyond the basic concept. Case in point, Tower of Hera is an especially weak dungeon. In concept, its gimmicks are pretty neat. The dungeon has a real sense of verticality to it, and it uses that verticality to its advantage by requiring that the player memorizes how the different floors relate to each other spatially so they can fall down in the correct way, twice, one of which being optional. Same goes for the other 2 mechanics at play here. The star switches and switch blocks are some of the more fleshed out gimmicks in A Link to the Past, and they're both introduced in Tower of Hera, but neither of them are utilized in any interesting ways and are only here to let the player know that the mechanic exists. Sure, later on they're used in more complex ways, but almost never in a way that makes them feel like a heavy aspect of any particular dungeon. This isn't to say that mechanics can't or shouldn't be shared between dungeons, but rather that when a dungeon doesn't focus on evolving 1 or 2 of those mechanics, it ends up feeling uninteresting or even unmemorable. Once you take away the inklings of a gimmick that Tower of Hera has, all that's left is a dungeon that feels like it was specifically designed to waste your time, despite the fact that it takes less than 10 minutes to finish, with the only memorable part being the fact that it has one of the worst bosses in the entire series. The Dark World dungeons are a little better. Palace of Darkness has a more complex layout than anything before it. Nothing too crazy, but the act of returning to the first room of the dungeon so you could take multiple paths makes this one of the more interesting dungeons. Thieves' Town has a decent gimmick in the first 4 rooms of needing to navigate a maze where the rafters in the foreground are obscuring your view of the floor itself, though the rest of the dungeon isn't nearly as interesting. Swamp Palace is one of the more realized dungeons in the game, having a theme of needing to figure out how to access these switches to raise and lower the water level. It's probably my favorite dungeon. Likewise, Skullwoods has multiple entrances from the clearly marked doorways to hidden holes in the overworld that drop you in different spots. Having to remember the general layout of a dungeon so you could figure out which entrance on the overworld correlates to where you need to go is a great gimmick, and feels very similar to what the Tower of Hera was trying to do. These 4 dungeons are all decent, and they prove that a dungeon doesn't necessarily need to be built around its item to be good, but they're still not quite designed like a traditional Zelda dungeon. The late game dungeons don't fare so well. I discussed earlier why I like Misery Mire and Ice Palace in terms of how their items both benefit the player in ways that help them with the other dungeon, but that is their only saving grace. Ice Palace has the theme of being slippery because it's ice. It's not fun. Not only is trying to navigate on the ice miserable, but the dungeon's layout is just tedious. You could skip the most tedious part if you got the item out of Misery Mire first, something they ruined in the GBA port for whatever reason, but even after doing that, this dungeon still isn't good. Misery Mire is such a nothing dungeon. The layout isn't interesting or coherent in any way, and there isn't a single central mechanic that the dungeon is built around. The item, the Staff of Samaria, the really interesting and unique and complex item that I was praising earlier that you're incentivized to get early in order to make the Ice Palace suck less, is used exactly once, to hold down the switch. Why? Why go through the trouble of creating such a unique item only to do nothing with it? Turtle Rock is the last standard dungeon in the game, and the very first thing you do in it is use the Staff of Samaria to create a platform on this rail. Something that the game has never asked you to do before and is only used in this dungeon. Apart from that, this dungeon is alright. The focus is mostly on these platforms, but it's never about how you use the item to make those platforms and always about how you control the platforms after you've already created them. It's certainly got the most consistent theme in the game, and it's also the best showcase of my point in all this. In a later classic-styled Zelda, these platforms would already be here, and you wouldn't be able to create new ones until after you obtain the Staff of Samaria halfway through the dungeon. Instead, you start out with the ability to make these platforms using an item that you already had that has never had this purpose before. Because of this, I don't think that it's right to say that A Link to the Past was the first game to use the standard dungeon formula. Sure, it's closer to that format than the first two games were, but it also doesn't completely follow through with that new direction and often feels stuck in the past. Ganon's Tower is a bit of a mixed bag. On one hand, this is certainly where the puzzles are at their most interesting and complex. I especially like the invisible floor puzzle that lets you use the recoil of a bomb to skip past it if you know what you're doing. I'm also pretty relaxed about the lack of being focused on a specific item here because getting a new weapon or puzzle solving tool 10 minutes before the game ends is a dumb idea for obvious reasons. A good final dungeon should recap some of the more memorable parts of previous dungeons, and Ganon's Tower does this pretty well. That being said, I'm not a huge fan of the Red Mill for a similar reason why I don't like the Master Sword. Zelda 1 hid the Red Ring in an out-of-the-way location that you were only going to find if you were incredibly thorough in exploring level 9. You weren't expected to obtain it. Instead, it was a final reward for exploration that made the fight with Ganon significantly easier. Here, it's practically out in the open. Yeah, you probably could skip it, but unless you're intentionally challenging yourself, then why would you? By making the act of acquiring it a given for most players, all that the game is doing is making everything after that easier when it should be harder. That sucks because combat is the focus of most of the dungeon after this point. The final climb to the top of the tower is painfully linear. The game never asks you to choose between two branching paths or figure out how to navigate the rest of the dungeon. It's just room after room of killing the same enemies you've been killing for the last few hours while avoiding mildly inconvenient room layouts. It's not particularly challenging, it's just a test of patience, and not a fun one. Look, the title of this video was not a lie. I don't think I've made it clear enough that I love A Link to the Past in spite of its problems. I think it's a fantastic game, and one of the better Zeldas in general. I don't think you'll find too many people who disagree with that opinion. I just don't think it's as masterfully created as other games in the series. Personally, I wouldn't even put it in the top 5. You might have noticed that I've been making a lot of comparisons between A Link to the Past and the two games that came before it, not just discussing how it's similar to the original game, but also pointing out the ways that it wasn't similar to Zelda 2. This was intentional. I want to reiterate that removing or changing aspects of the first game isn't a bad thing, and in the same way that Zelda 2 evolves the resource management aspects of that game while mostly neglecting its other elements, A Link to the Past evolves the swordplay and puzzle-solving aspects of the first game while mostly neglecting its resource management and combat mechanics. In both cases, I love these evolutions. I even prefer A Link to the Past's methods on paper. I just think that Zelda 2 does a better job of fully committing to its change than A Link to the Past does. If nothing else, I don't think that any of my criticisms are anything that makes the game actively unfun to play. At its worst, the Ice Palace can be a little tedious, but the rest of the game is still consistently good. It's far more approachable to newcomers than the first two games, it's got terrific artwork, a fantastic soundtrack, and the story deepens the lore of the series to the point where the majority of future titles all build off of it directly. I understand why people hold this game in such high regard, and I don't blame anyone for thinking it's the best. I just prefer the first game.